MSW, ACSWE, is a professor at Simmons College Graduate School of Social Work and the Simmons Scott School of Nursing and Health Sciences. He is a highly sought after trainer and consultant in topics which include board development, international social work practice, elder and family housing program development, issues pertaining to diversity, social justice and human rights, and working with gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender communities. He is a past president of NASW USA. In 2010, Professor Bailey was elected president of the International Federation of Social Workers, the first person of color to hold this post. Professor Bailey is a recipient of numerous awards and honors. He was named Social Worker of the Year by both the National and NASW Massachusetts chapter in 1998. He was selected as an NASW Social Work Pioneer in 2005. In 2013, Professor Bailey was honored by the University of Connecticut with a degree of Doctor of Humane Letters honoris causa. Professor Gary Bailey.
Good evening, everyone. Buenas noches. You all have been so patient sitting there all day and most of the evening, so I'm going to try to not repeat what has been said already, but try to lift up and highlight some pieces that I think are significant and important for us to take away. But before I begin my remarks, as someone who has spent so much of my time, as I'm often reminded by my beloved and by my family, I spend more time away from home than I do at home. That has a cost, but that's also the role that volunteer leadership brings with it, is that volunteer leadership means that you are constantly on the road. After I leave here this week, I go to Kampala, Uganda, where I will participate in the International Consortium for Social Development for 2 days, and then finally being able to get a bit of a summer vacation, and then back to my work at Simmons College. But what I would like to do, and I'd like to ask you to join me in doing right now, is giving another round of applause to Dr. Rock, who is the outgoing president of ACSWE, and who has done such a phenomenal job. Congratulations. I know how hard she works because I see Letty all over the world, and she is continuously committed to the work of this organization and all that it is about. So thank you so much. I'd also like to acknowledge the president, the regional president for Latin America and the Caribbean for IFSW, Ms. Laura Cotto, who's there with the camera, and it's good to see her here, who is visiting from Argentina. And I hope you will be able to go to her session tomorrow, Laura? Wednesday. Her session, which will be very important as she begins to help think about the ways in which we are conceiving of how the definition of social work is both something that is both macro in perspective, but also micro in the way in which it will be delivered. I also want to encourage all of you, while you have this opportunity here, and I've had this conversation with some of you, and this is my second time in Korsou. I was invited to Korsou, I think about 4 years ago, by Keith Carlo, to begin a dialogue about the development of an identity of social work from a Caribbean perspective. How do we begin to think about social work through the lens of a non-colonial perspective? And if you've ever spent any time with Keith Carlo, it is amazing. You are constantly running back and forth. I think I did more radio shows, went to more meetings, had more entertainments saw more of Korsou than it would have been possible if this was my only visit. And so I want also to give a round of applause to Keith Carlo for ensuring that we are here today. So thank you, Keith, for that as well. So I bring you greetings on behalf of the International Federation of Social Workers, which is over 745,000 members in 88 countries around the world. Now, the conference that you are a part of has been described as seeking to address the mandate of stakeholders and constituents in the Caribbean region and in Latin America, and keep focusing on common historical and current experiences and efforts to develop solutions and to produce innovative social development innovations which can ultimately lead to sustainable regional integration in an era of critical transformation for nation-building processes. That's an exciting call to action, my friends, but that is a lot to take on and to try to do. If you've ever had the opportunity, and I hope some of you will have the opportunity to visit me in my office at Simmons College in Boston, Massachusetts, you will find that I surround myself with sayings and mottos and talismans to keep me going. And so that my walls have numbers of quotes in all sorts of languages as ways for me to pay attention to what others have said that help to remind me about what it is that I get up every day loving to do. And one of the quotes that I return to more often than not is one by the ex-slave and civil rights advocate Frederick Douglass, which contains the words, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." Douglass went on to say, "Let me give you a word of the philosophy of reform. The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. The conflict has been exciting, agitating, all-absorbing, and for the time being, putting all other tumults to silence. It must do this, for it does nothing. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both a moral and a physical one, but it will be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows, or with both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, and it may be both a moral and physical one. But my friends, it will be a struggle. So as we look here in the year 2013 and reflect on what this year means to so many of us, it has enormous significance to many of us here in this room. 2013 in the United States saw the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, which was an event that has gone unheralded, but which was an event that was historic in that it granted freedom, the first wave of freedom for an enslaved people. Here in the Dutch Caribbean, some parts of the community are reflecting on the 150th anniversary of the abolition of slavery in this parts of the Caribbean. These were the ultimate and penultimate human rights violations. But we also know that these human rights violations continue to occur in our world today. Modern-day slavery and human trafficking continue to be issues that confront us if we will just open our eyes and begin to observe what goes on in front of our very faces. Human rights are core to social work values and are intrinsic to social justice. We know that the fight against poverty, violence, racism, sexism, homophobia, and environmental degradation are problems throughout the world. And the social work profession is mandated to promote the amelioration of these issues. Though far too often, human rights violations are perceived as being inflicted by corrupt dictators on the hapless people in countries far away from home, rather than looking at what we're doing right in our own backyards. However, we as social workers know that the violations of human rights and dignity are so close at hand and entrenched in the history of so many of our nations. I know personally, as the direct descendant of slaves, who is only 3 generations away from this pernicious institution. 3 of my great-grandmothers, as I've done my family history, I can find their names in slave documents. My great-grandmother Mathilde, my great-grandmother Jane, and my great-grandmother Julia. So that I know, and I hope that you know, that human rights violations are still too prevalent in many of our own societies. The recent protests that are occurring in Egypt, that have been occurring in Turkey, the civil war that is occurring in Syria, protests that have happened in Malta, even the recent bombings in my beloved Boston, as well as the assassination of parliamentarian and professional trained youth and community social worker Helman Magno Valles, who worked here in the barrios of Korsou, have caused me to consider. And that assassination, let me say something about that assassination. That assassination happened in broad daylight. That happened in broad daylight to someone who was a social worker but also a member of Parliament right here in Willemstad. So all of these problems have caused me to begin to consider if the problems we face are too large and if we the people are too small to deal with them. I've had to wrestle with a sense of hopelessness in a world that has caused me to go deeper and to think more broadly about cause and effect. Globally, people are confronted by issues of poverty, a lack of access to quality education, unaffordable and or inadequate housing, and the lack of needed health and mental health services. So after much thought and reflection, what I have arrived at is that we need more professional social workers now more than ever. The Swiss philosopher Henri Friedrich Amiel wrote, "Everything depends upon the preservation, the presence and preservation or the absence of the single element in the soul, and that is hope." And the historian Howard Zinn said, "To be hopeful in bad times is not foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. History is full of instances where people, against enormous odds, have come together to struggle for liberty and justice, and have won, though they have not won often enough, but enough to suggest how much more is possible." So my colleagues of the social work profession, professional social workers I know, and I hope you know, improve and enrich the lives of individuals and families, and help to build strong communities. Social work is truly a global profession. Professional social work exists all over the world. Social workers provide critical services in rural, urban, and suburban areas, and have long been society's safety net for a broad range of issues, including child welfare, mental and behavioral health, aging, corrections, health, military social work, veterans affairs, and most importantly, I would argue, we are always on the front line when it comes to disaster relief. There's an incentive, I believe, for qualified and skilled people to go into and continue in the field of social work. At the same time, I recognize, however, the challenges of funding. And given the current global financial situation, which is due largely, and I would argue, which is due primarily to worldwide economic collapse and the bailing out of banks and the taking away of needed services from the people by those who need the least. Last year at this time, I was in Sweden attending the Joint World Conference on Social Work and Social Development. While there, I had the opportunity to attend a reception at the Swedish Town Hall, where I heard the deputy mayor explain that it was the site of the Nobel Prize festivities. And it brought to mind for me that 2 Nobel laureates for peace were social workers, something that we so often forget. They were not only social workers, but they were women. The American Jane Addams, who was the founder of Hull House in 1931, and then 70 years later, in 2011, the Liberian social worker, Madame Lema Roberta Gawobi, whom I had the honor of meeting in July of last year in Washington, D.C., at the NASW USA Hope Conference. It is also interesting that both times the prizes were jointly shared. Jane Addams was too ill to attend the ceremony, so there's no record of her remarks. But Ms. Gawobi has said of her work in Liberia, she said to me personally before she began her speech, she said that the reason she became a professional social worker was because she had been an abused spouse. She had been someone who had been abused by her partner, and she had to make a choice. And her choice was that she was either going to kill the person who was abusing her, that's one option, or she was going to figure a way to get herself out of the situation, and if she got herself out of the situation, she committed to trying to work with young women to make sure they didn't get in it. And so she sat on her front porch, and she would watch young women walk by, and she would talk to young girls, and began a women and a young girls group, talking to them about their own worth and their own value. And it grew from one young woman stopping to talk to her on her front porch to 2 to 3 to 4. As we heard this morning, if we think about culture and community, she built culture and community on that front porch of bringing together young women to begin to think about how do they actualize their own power and not become victims of someone else's abuse. But what she said to me at that time was, we worked daily confronting warlords. And you have to remember that Liberia at that time had undergone civil war. And so she said that when she had faced down her abuser, it was nothing for her to think about facing down warlords, because she had faced down her own personal warlord. It had been the person who had entrapped her in physical abuse. And so she, along with these other young women, faced down the warlords, meeting with the dictators and refusing to be silenced in the face of AK-47s and RPGs. She said, we walked when we had no transportation, we fasted when water was unaffordable, and we held hands in the face of danger. We spoke truth to power when everyone else was being diplomatic, and we stood under the rain and the sun with our children to tell the world the stories of the other side of conflict. Our educational backgrounds, travel experiences, faiths, and social classes did not matter. We had a common agenda. And she went on to say that her Nobel Prize could not have come at a better time than it did, a time when global and community conversations were about how local community members and unarmed children could help turn their upside-down world and help the world to go right side up. It has come at a time when unarmed citizens, men and women, boys and girls, are challenging dictatorships and ushering in democracy and the sovereignty of people. So in 2010 in Hong Kong, our 3 global social work organizations, ACSWE, ICSWE, and IFSWE, came together and collectively agreed that the field of social work practice, and education were often marginalized in many of our own countries and also in relevant international organizations. As a friend of mine likes to say, it wasn't about us having a seat at the table. We didn't even don't know where the room was, where the table existed. You know, that old motto about you want to have a seat at the table. She said you have to know where the room is to be even able to have a seat at the table. And as she talks about that as being the ways in which so often we have been marginalized. And also in some areas of social development. The decision of organizing that common Congress with our sister organizations was a political decision. And it was a decision to organize social work, social development practitioners, and social work educators who wanted to work together to articulate a set of common goals. The challenges which we collectively face were many and are many, and call for united voice and more solidarity. The current global situation and situations are calling for more social work unity and even more engagement. Beyond the shared understanding of the necessity to be organized and being relevant in the international arena, we have to develop more clear and effective ways of promoting strategies and actions which we know will influence the setting of an international agenda. And out of that work in Hong Kong, 3 of us sitting in a room without windows in Hong Kong, taking feedback from rapporteurs who were going to meetings and listening to what people were saying, we crafted the first wave of the global agenda for social work and social development. Abe Tase, Charles Abe, and myself. And then we took that forth and vetted it to our members. And that became the global agenda for social work and social development. This document was envisioned as the beginning, not the end. So often we think of things that when they are put in print as being the end. This is the beginning of a larger movement that we aim to lead as international organizations in response to economic inequalities within countries and among regions, the growing inequalities and their implications for marginalized populations, the prevention and management of man-made and natural disasters and their implications for the social work profession and the environment. Let me stop here and say I was startled this morning listening to the news. I don't know if any of you were listening to the news this morning about the train derailment in Canada. Through the small town where toxic substances were going through a small town near Montreal in Canada and had an accident and exploded. And what I was struck by was the way in which they described the numbers of people who were missing, who were just vaporized by the fumes from the fire from this implosion. And what does it mean when someone thinks that they're able to take toxic substances through communities where people live without thinking about their safety? This is something that we as social workers have to be responsible for and have to challenge. We have to look at the increasing global political instabilities, violence, domination, the erosion of peace-building processes, increased terrorism, and responses by states in their ways of handling global conflicts. Human rights issues and violations in relation to global social, political, and economic situations were front and center to our thinking. We also had to look at issues of migration, refugees, immigrants, and immigration, and the handling of these issues and their future implications, and family issues and life challenges across the lifespan. These emerged as major concerns in relation to the transformation of the world. I said recently, at the dawn of the new millennium, so many people were concerned that our computers would crash when the year 2000 happened. Does anyone remember that? Everybody, at least I remember that. Everybody was so concerned. People were backing up their data People were told that they couldn't travel because the computers are going to crash. We don't know what will happen. That year was referred to as Y2K. Well, something else important was happening that night in 2000 as we began to think about Y2K, was that the first wave of baby boomers began to turn 65. The largest group of older people the world has ever seen that no one had really planned for. We had done more planning for something that didn't happen and had really not done any planning for something that was knocking at our door and will continue to knock at our door for the next 36 years. The so-called global silver tsunami of people aging in place and where indeed our services are not equipped to handle or to deal with them. Or as I talk to my students about going in to work with older people, as they say to me, well, Professor Bailey, I want to work with children and family. And I say to them, well, you know, most of my friends didn't get married until they were in their late 30s, early 40s, that most of my friends' children are just going to college as they are turning 60. They are taking care of their parents so that they are sending their children off to college, still caring for their parents. They are the ultimate sandwich generation. And then we are having to think about how are we going to take care of these multi-generational families. But people want to continue to think about working with the traditional family system. And so when I talk to my students about the demographic shift, and I put the numbers in front of them in terms of what families look like and will continue to look like, and then I talk to them about who the baby boomers were. The baby boomers were the generation that changed the world as we know it. And they did not do it silently, they did not do it peacefully, and they did not take no for an answer. And they are changing the face of aging as we know it. They are not going to sit on someone's porch and rock quietly. Now they might rock. They might rock to music and dance and be out and about, but they're not going to sit and rock back and forth like my grandparents did because somehow they were told that they no longer mattered to society. The global agenda is something that we continue to see as being something that is a beginning of a larger movement, that we want to continue to transform the world. And we particularly are focusing on issues of poverty. Just as the Millennium Development Goals focus on poverty, so do the Global Agenda for Social Development and Social Work. Mahatma Gandhi said that poverty is the worst form of violence. As social workers, we must redouble our efforts to eradicate poverty and to make sure that the impact of so-called austerity measures, which hurt the most vulnerable around the world, I identify and push back against. Note I say eradicate, not live with or deal with. We have to use bigger language than we have been using. There's an old Jamaican proverb that says, if you reach for the moon, if you reach for a star, you fall on the moon. Well, if we don't use big language, if we talk about dealing with poverty, then when we're not able to succeed, we succeed in much smaller ways, so that we really do have to reach much larger. And so the eradication of poverty is something that I really want us to begin to identify and to use in our language. We have to look at the current global economic situation, which calls for us to raise our collective voices and to increase our professional unity and engagement, so that as a profession, we can be more influential and relevant in the international political and economic arenas. IFSW and its member organizations around the world are committed to social and economic justice and the unimpeded access to services for all. Our 15 policy statements address basic concepts from a social work perspective, taking into consideration that each professional social worker possesses different insights. There's not one way to do it, based on in-depth knowledge and experience, which enables them to contribute to the ongoing dialogue which impacts some of the broadest issues confronting contemporary society. It was in that vein that IFSW supported the global Occupy protests. Those protests exposed the omnipresent income and social inequalities which have gripped nations in recent years. The world's so-called new economy is a tale of skewed wealth and income. The new economy generates extraordinary riches for the few, but creates declining wages, rising debt, and the risk of deep and persistent poverty for many. IFSW as an organization supports social, economic, and political action to end poverty and the vast inequalities in wealth and income to which protesters at global Occupy events so effectively drew attention. Social workers know that joblessness and economic insecurity contribute to the incidence of mental illness, family violence, suicide, substance abuse, crime, diminished capacity for healthy family and community function, and also, I would argue, unprotected sexual acting out, which only contributes to the increase in HIV and AIDS. People are going to do whatever they can to try to feel better when they don't have something that gives them an opportunity to feel better. It is this knowledge and experience that gives the social work profession a special responsibility to advocate for income and employment and social support policies that the recent actions by the IMF and the EU in Cyprus and the sequestration that is going on currently in the United States, which has already begun resulting in devastating program cuts that have a human face to them and impact the most vulnerable, further highlight how much current global financial systems are in disarray. In June of 2013, Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi, who had spent numbers of years under house arrest in Burma, said, "We are fortunate to be living in an age when social welfare and humanitarian assistance are recognized not only as desirable but necessary. I am fortunate to be living in an age when the fate of prisoners of conscience anywhere has become the concern of peoples everywhere. An age when democracy and human rights are widely, if not universally, accepted as the birthright of all." She described how often during her years under house arrest, she had drawn strength from her favorite passages in the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It reads, "Disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspirations of common people. It is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse, as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law." She went on to say that the peace of our world is indivisible. As long as negative forces are getting the better of positive forces anywhere, we are all at risk. It may be questioned whether all negative forces can ever be removed. She said the simple answer is no. It is in human nature to contain both the positive and the negative. However, it is also within human capability to work to reinforce the positive and to minimize or neutralize the negative. Absolute peace in our world is an unattainable goal, but it is one towards which we must continue to journey, our eyes fixed on it as a traveler in a desert fixes his eye on the guiding star that will lead him to salvation. Even if we do not achieve perfect peace on earth, because perfect peace is not of this earth, common endeavors to gain peace will unite individuals and nations in trust and friendship and help to make our human community safer and kinder. I use the word kinder, she said, after careful deliberation. I might say the careful deliberation of many years. Of the sweets of adversity, let me say, these are not numerous. I have found the sweetest, the most precious of all, is the lesson I learned on the value of kindness. Every kindness I received, small or big, convinced me that there could never be enough of it in our world. To be kind is to respond with sensitivity and human warmth to the hopes and needs of others. Even the briefest touch of kindness can lighten a heavy heart. Kindness can change the lives of people. Well, my friends and colleagues, we as social workers understand those words, the impact of kindness on human beings. Kindness is not saying that we do not take political action, but it is, as Malcolm Payne has said, and has been noted as saying, the recognition of our humanness, which sometimes is just taking the time to give someone a touch, to be present, or even just to listen to another human being. Much of society believes that they only encounter a social worker when dealing with a problem such as moving a family member from hospital to care homes or a nursing home, because there's limited public understanding of the role of professional social work and that of social workers. I know that's true in my own family, and as I talk to my family members and tell them that I'm a professional social worker, their eyes glaze over because they're not quite sure what that means. They're never quite sure what I do. And sometimes that's to my advantage. But it is so important for them to be able to understand that we improve the lives of individuals, families, and communities around the world. And the need for social work services will only increase over time. During the course of my over 30-year career, I have met many numbers of people, my own family included, who really have no universal awareness of social work. Yet they lack an accurate knowledge related to the education and credentials needed to be a professional social worker. They did not appreciate the diversity of the work. They were confused by the use of the more general term case or care worker or human services worker, terms often used interchangeably with that of professional social worker. We have a very good friend